The year 1847 settled over rural Georgia like a slow and heavy mist, thick with the unspoken tensions of a land built on ownership, obedience, and the kind of silence that soured into secrets. The Clayton twins, Eleanor and Isabel, were born into this world with the peculiar burden of being identical in face, but opposite in temperament. Their father, Silas Clayton, was one of those Southern men whose wealth was measured not only by crops, but by the number of human beings he believed he possessed by God's design. He enjoyed repeating that the twins were his pride, because they proved his family line still produced beauty, even as the plantation cracked under debts, drought, and his own aging cruelty. The girls grew up walking the same wooden halls, studying under the same tutors, moving like two halves of a shared shadow. Yet the moment they stepped outdoors, where the enslaved men and women worked under the hard sun, the twins began to diverge. Eleanor watched everything with a quiet fury she never dared to speak aloud, memorizing which overseer was cruelest, which child had fresh bruises, which mother winced when she knelt. Isabel, bolder but softer at heart, constantly questioned the rules she was told were natural and necessary. Their father dismissed their compassion as youthful softness that marriage would eventually correct. But marriage meant proximity to plantation men, and both twins dreaded the idea. Their world changed when they were 19, and their father purchased two enslaved brothers, Samuel and Peter, who carried themselves with an unusual mix of defiance and intelligence that both twins noticed immediately. Samuel was calm, observant, and quietly rebellious, resisting in subtle ways that infuriated the overseers. Peter, 2 years younger, possessed a rare gentleness that seemed almost dangerous because it reminded anyone watching him that enslaved men were still human despite every system designed to deny it. Eleanor first spoke to Samuel the day she found him reading a discarded newspaper scrap behind the smokehouse. She asked how he learned, and he answered her without fear, saying he had been taught by a pastor who believed every soul deserved literacy, even if the Lord disagreed. His tone was not apologetic, but resolute. That moment tilted Eleanor's world. She realized that the version of life her father preached was collapsing the more she learned about the minds and spirits of the people he claimed to own. Isabel met Peter by accident when she tripped during a rainstorm and slid down the muddy slope behind the stables. Peter rushed to help her before a servant could arrive, and she noticed how gently he steadied her, as if he were comforting someone he cared for, rather than assisting the daughter of the man who legally controlled his life. There were no dramatic sparks, no thunderous revelations, only a quiet warmth that unsettled her more than any lecture or sermon ever had. She began finding excuses to cross paths with him, pretending to search for lost items or inspect the garden, even though she knew full well she was risking scandal or worse. The forbidden nature of their interactions made every small moment feel larger than life. A brief glance felt like stolen treasure. A shared sentence felt like rebellion. And slowly what began as curiosity grew into something neither twin could ignore. Something that felt more like truth than any rule they had been raised with. But the South of 1847 was a place where love was not merely discouraged, but violently forbidden when crossed with the boundaries of race and enslavement. Rumors had a way of becoming punishable offenses. The overseers noticed everything. The law enforced the ownership of bodies and the destruction of any bond that threatened the hierarchy. Yet the twins were too deep into their own awakening to turn back. The more the world pressed against them, the more tightly they clung to the idea that love was not only possible but necessary, even if it cost them the only life they had ever known. The Clayton household began to sense something shifting. Their father grew suspicious, convinced his daughters were hiding something. The overseers pressed Samuel and Peter with harsher penalties for even minor infractions, clearly attempting to break whatever unspoken bond was forming. But defiance bloomed in quiet places. The twins began meeting the brothers in the abandoned field house at the edge of the property, under the pretense of inspecting old ledgers or retrieving blankets for the winter. It was in that dimly lit space, smelling of dust and pine, that the seeds of the impossible pact began to take root. What the twins did not know was that Samuel and Peter were already planning their own escape. They had heard whispers of a route northward, a clandestine chain of helpers who moved at night and vanished by dawn. But running alone meant abandoning the only women who had ever treated them like equals. Staying meant risking their lives. Love in a world like theirs was not merely complicated, it was fatal. And yet, by the winter of 1847, the impossible decision had crystallized into a shared truth. The twins could not live the lives their father intended. Samuel and Peter could not remain enslaved. Their futures were tied together whether the world approved or not. If society demanded separation, then they would be the ones to defy it. They would choose each other over the chains of expectation. The pact they formed was never written, never spoken aloud in full, but breathed into being through stolen moments, shared glances, and the unshakable certainty that love was worth any consequence. In the secrecy of that collapsing field house, they made a vow that would have shaken the entire county had it been discovered. The Georgia twins would marry the men their father believed he owned, not out of rebellion alone, but because it was the only truth their hearts could accept. The winter deepened slowly across the plantation, bringing with it a hush that seemed to wrap itself around every secret the land had ever swallowed. The trees stood bare like silent witnesses, and the wind carried the faint groan of old wooden structures settling under the cold. Eleanor felt the season pressing on her like a reminder that time was slipping and choices could not be postponed forever. She spent her nights staring at the frost-streaked window, wondering how a life of comfort could feel like a prison, while the world outside burned with danger yet offered the only path that felt truly hers. Isabel moved through the house like she was half present in every room, distracted and anxious. She had become more skilled at hiding her fear under smiles and polite conversation, but inside her thoughts raced. She worried constantly about Peter's safety, especially after seeing fresh lash marks on his back one morning. He tried to laugh it off, saying he had been careless in carrying a crate of tools, but she knew the overseers were tightening their grip. Any sign of defiance, even imagined, was enough to justify cruelty. The fear that he might one day never return from the fields hollowed out her chest in a way she could not confess to anyone but Eleanor. Samuel, on the other hand, had developed a quiet determination so profound it seemed carved into his very posture. He spent his evenings carving a small wooden token, something he kept hidden but held with reverence whenever he thought no one was looking. Eleanor noticed the way his hands trembled sometimes, not with fear, but with the trembling weight of decisions that would change everything. The Underground Railroad was more than a rumor now. There were real possibilities, real routes, and real danger. Samuel knew escape was survival, but every time he saw Eleanor, he felt the pull of something stronger than freedom alone. It was the maddening realization that the heart could chain a man even when his body longed to run. The pact between the four of them grew bolder. What began as exchanged words became plans, and plans became actions. The field house became their sanctuary, the only place where they could speak freely. Even in whispers, their conversations carried more urgency than anything they said during daylight hours. Eleanor and Isabel smuggled pieces of bread, dried meats, old clothing, and small items that could be sold or traded. Samuel mapped out potential routes using scraps of overheard conversations between traders and travelers. Peter gathered information from enslaved workers on neighboring plantations who knew the land better than any surveyor. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into a world where rules no longer applied. The twins learned to navigate fear not by ignoring it, but by transforming it into purpose. They rehearsed excuses for their absences, practiced concealing emotions under polite expressions, and perfected the art of slipping away unnoticed. The thrill terrified them, but it also awakened something fierce, something that made the life they had always known seem smaller and dimmer. But the danger was growing just as fast. The overseers had begun sniffing around with a suspicion that had nothing to do with proof and everything to do with intuition. They had noticed the way Samuel paused too long near the main house, the way Peter seemed to finish tasks more quickly than expected, the way the twins requested fewer supervised outings and more time alone. Silas Clayton, always paranoid and always prideful, sensed that his daughters were not as compliant as he had once believed. He started insisting on knowing where they went, whom they talked to, and why they needed so many walks in the far fields. His questions were sharp, his temper sharper. The twins learned to lie with smooth voices, but the fear of discovery hovered like a shadow that grew longer each day. The turning point came on a night when the moon hung low, and the air felt unnaturally still. Samuel and Peter slipped away early from their quarters, using the darkness as their shield. The twins were already waiting in the field house, their lantern dimmed to the faintest flicker. Samuel entered first, his steps urgent. He closed the door quickly, his breath visible in the cold. He said he had heard something that could not be ignored. A trader from South Carolina had been boasting at a nearby tavern about a new law being pushed that would tighten restrictions on enslaved people, especially men in their 20s and 30s. There were rumors that patrols would be doubled and punishments for suspected runaways would become more severe than anything the plantation had seen. It might even become illegal for enslaved people to travel with written permission without a second witness. The window for escape was shrinking. Eleanor listened with her heart pounding, realizing that if they did not move soon, they might never get another chance. Isabel's hands shook so violently that Peter took them in his, trying to steady her. The field house felt smaller than ever, its wooden beams pressing down on them like the weight of every secret they had ever dared to keep. That night, the pact transformed from a dream into a deadline. They decided that when the spring harvest began and the overseers were too busy maintaining the fields to monitor every movement, Samuel and Peter would slip away. Eleanor and Isabel would help them gather supplies and create distractions. The twins also made a choice that defied every law, every expectation, and every piece of their upbringing. They said they would not let the men they loved face the unknown alone. They would follow after them, leaving behind their names, their inheritance, and their entire world. Samuel protested fiercely at first, convinced that such a decision would be a death sentence. He told Eleanor that if she followed, she would lose everything, that people like her were not meant to survive the journey northward. But Eleanor looked at him with a resolve that made his arguments crumble. She said that a life without him was not a life she wanted to claim. Peter, too, resisted the idea of Isabel joining them, fearing for her safety, but Isabel refused to bend. She said she would rather die running than live trapped. Their decision was not romantic fantasy, but a desperate truth born of the times they were living in. Love had become their rebellion. Freedom had become their shared destination. The lines between what they were born into and what they chose for themselves had blurred beyond recognition. In that dim room with the faint glow of a dying lantern casting trembling shadows on the walls, they sealed their pact with something more powerful than words. They held hands, all four of them, forming a circle that the world would have condemned. A bond that, as far as the law was concerned, was a crime. But to them, it was the only thing that felt honest. The night deepened until silence pressed against the walls, but none of them dared to leave just yet. They knew the next months would determine everything, their futures, their lives, their love, and the legacy of two twins who dared to challenge the world they were born into. When they finally parted, it was with the unshakable awareness that they had crossed a threshold they could never return from. The forbidden Pact of 1847 had been set into motion, and there was no force strong enough to undo what their hearts had chosen. The months that followed moved with a strange combination of urgency and unbearable slowness. Spring approached inch by inch, and with it came the sense that every moment was preparing them for a line they could never uncross. The twins felt the world shifting under their feet, even when the plantation looked unchanged. Every hallway, every dining room conversation, and every distant sound from the fields carried a layer of tension that made ordinary days feel like fragile masks stretched over secrets too large to contain. Silas Clayton grew more restless as the season changed. He paced the halls at night, muttering about declining profits and unreliable workers. His suspicions seemed to seep into every corner of the household. He questioned the overseers relentlessly, demanding reports on productivity, behavior, and potential troublemakers. Samuel especially had caught his attention. Silas didn't know what he sensed exactly, but he felt something in the air whenever the older of the enslaved brothers passed by. Something too calm, too intelligent, too unreadable. Men like Samuel threatened the fragile illusion of control that men like Silas relied upon. Eleanor noticed her father's growing scrutiny and began planning more carefully. She moved their rendezvous spots, varied her excuses, and even pretended to read certain books so she could claim she needed quiet spaces away from the main house. Isabel learned to feign headaches to escape afternoon commitments, retreating to her room where she could slip out unnoticed through the back staircase. They became experts at deception, not out of malice but survival. Every lie was protection. Every misdirection was a shield for the people they loved. But as the twins adapted, the overseers grew more aggressive. Samuel and Peter were worked harder, punished for the smallest missteps, and kept under a tighter watch. Once, Samuel returned to the field house with a cut above his eyebrow, a split caused by an overseer who accused him of hesitating before following an order. Eleanor wanted to scream when she saw it, but Samuel simply wiped the blood away and told her not to panic. His eyes, however, betrayed the truth. The window of time was shrinking faster than any of them had predicted. Weeks before the harvest, a rumor swept through the enslaved quarters like wildfire. A patrol had caught 2 runaways from a neighboring county, and the punishment had been brutal. Their bodies were put on display as a warning, something that sent waves of horror and anger across the workers. Peter witnessed the aftermath when a passing patrol carried the story to their plantation, describing it with a coldness that made his stomach turn. He didn't speak of it to Isabel, not wanting to frighten her, but the image burned in his mind. He knew that if their plan failed, their fate would be worse. One evening, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky cracked with thunder, and the rain hammered the earth with such force that it drowned out every other sound. The twins slipped away under the cover of the tempest, cloaks pulled tight, hearts pounding. When they reached the field house, Samuel and Peter were already there, soaked but waiting. The storm created the perfect cover for an emergency meeting. The wind rattled the wooden shutters as Eleanor lit a small lantern. The thin flame flickered wildly, casting stretched shadows across their faces. Samuel spoke first, his voice low but urgent. He said they had to move sooner than planned. The overseers were preparing new measures, including nighttime rounds. The harvest rush wouldn't be enough of a distraction if patrols doubled, and Silas insisted on monitoring his property more closely. The opportunity was slipping. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't ready. She was ready in spirit. She had been ready since the day she realized she loved Peter, but the idea of leaving everything behind on such short notice made her dizzy. She thought of her bedroom, her books, the dresses folded neatly in her wardrobe. All the things she had once believed defined her life now felt small next to the fear of losing Peter. She tried to steady her breathing, counting silently until her pulse slowed. Peter took her hands, holding them between his own, grounding her. He whispered that he wouldn't let anything happen to her, that he would carry her if he had to, that he would face every danger if she chose to walk with him. The sincerity in his voice dissolved her hesitation like sugar in boiling water. Eleanor was stronger in that moment than she had ever been. She told Samuel that they would adapt, that they had been preparing for months and could accelerate the plan. She felt no fear in her voice, though it thrummed through her veins. She believed in Samuel, in their pact, and in the future she refused to surrender. The storm raged outside as they crafted the revised plan. It would require precision and trust. The men would leave first, during a night when the plantation was distracted by an event Silas was planning, a gathering of local landowners to discuss the coming season. The twins would create opportunities for Samuel and Peter to slip away from their work early. They would sneak food, clothing, and the crude map Samuel had drawn. That same night, the twins would also take their own steps toward escape, though their path would diverge initially for safety. They would meet at a landmark miles away, a twisted oak at the edge of a dried riverbed, known only to those who had walked the land for years. When the storm began to ease, they knew they had only minutes left before they had to return to their respective worlds. Peter leaned forward and pressed his forehead to Isabel's, a gesture so intimate that it made the air in the room hold still. Samuel stood before Eleanor, taking her hands in a way that felt both tender and decisive. He told her that if anything happened to him, she must still run. Eleanor shook her head, refusing to accept the possibility. As they parted, the storm's last rumble of thunder echoed through the night, sealing their vow like a celestial witness. The world outside remained dangerous and unpredictable, but inside that field house, they had forged a connection that no law, no overseer, and no fear could sever. The next weeks would carry them toward the most perilous moment of their lives. They would face choices that could destroy everything they had ever known. They would gamble their lives for a chance at something the world insisted they could never have. But their hearts had chosen their path long before their footsteps did. And the spring of 1847 was about to become the season that tested and defined the forbidden pact of the Georgia twins. The days leading to the escape were a blur of whispered instructions, stolen glances, and secret preparations. Every movement was measured, every word deliberate. The twins moved through the plantation with a calm that belied the storm of thoughts within them. They had memorized every guard rotation, every patrol path, every weak point in the fence surrounding the quarters. Even minor details, the squeak of the back gate, the shadows cast by the moon, were studied as if they were steps in a dangerous dance. Elizabeth and Catherine spent hours disguising themselves with darker clothing, smudging their faces with soot from the hearth to make their features less recognizable in the night. They wrapped their hair tightly beneath scarves, muffled their voices, and left decoys in their bedrooms to suggest they were asleep. Each night, the plantation seemed more like a cage than ever before, every familiar corner a potential trap. The tension was almost unbearable, yet they pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear, love, and defiance. Samuel and Elijah had their own tasks. They had prepared a makeshift cart to carry supplies, including food, blankets, and a few precious personal items they could not risk leaving behind. Every nail hammered and rope tied carried the weight of months of secrecy. They worked in silence, knowing the smallest noise could alert the overseers or Silas himself. The air between them and the twins was electric, an unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. On the night of March 17, 1847, the world seemed to hold its breath. A new moon hung in the sky, offering little light but providing a cloak of darkness perfect for their flight. The wind whispered through the cotton fields, and every rustle of leaves sounded like both a warning and a signal. The twins left the main house first, slipping silently from their rooms with hearts hammering. They moved through the shadows, guided by landmarks only they knew, until they reached the designated meeting point near the stables. There, Samuel and Elijah were waiting, their faces lit briefly by a lantern hidden in the hayloft. No words were necessary. Hands met, fingers entwined, hearts synchronized. Every second felt suspended in time as they climbed into the cart, blankets and bundles stacked carefully to hide their presence. The first push through the mud-slicked paths was slow, deliberate. Every sound, the creak of a wheel, the snap of a twig, the distant bark of a hound, was magnified in their minds. They moved as one, a single entity bound by desperation and love, the landscape of Georgia stretching around them like a living, breathing obstacle course. Silas Clayton was oblivious at first. The household was distracted by preparations for a dinner gathering, and the twins had left no obvious trace. Even the enslaved workers were unaware until after the fact. By the time the alarm was raised, the group was already several miles away, leaving behind only whispers and confusion. Silas raged, sending men along every road, but the darkness and the careful planning had already given the escapees a crucial lead. The journey north was grueling. Every night they traveled under the cover of darkness, hiding during the day in barns, abandoned homes, and the occasional sympathetic farmstead. Rain, mud, and biting cold tested their endurance, but the bond between the four strengthened with every step. Letters, journals, and later accounts suggest that the twins kept their spirits alive with small rituals, quiet songs, whispered stories of home, and plans for the life they imagined waiting at the end of the journey. Along the way they encountered both dangers and helpers. Some were kind strangers, risking fines and imprisonment to offer food or guidance. Others were men and women who tried to exploit them, seeing an opportunity in their vulnerability. Each encounter demanded judgment, trust, and courage. Every decision carried weight not only for their own lives but for the fragile network that had helped them so far. By late March, the party reached the outskirts of Charleston, where they finally boarded a ship bound for Philadelphia. The sea offered a final barrier between their past and the new life they sought. Samuel's hands were steady on the ropes and pulleys. Elijah guided the cart-like vessel to the gangplank, and the twins stood together, fear and excitement etched into their faces. As the ship pulled away from the familiar coastline, the plantations, fields, and the life they had known receding behind them, a quiet sense of liberation took hold.